All right, so we are in week 4, church history. We are spanning the period now in this week from about 1648, call it 1700, to right before the First World War in 1914. So the back end of the Age of Reason and Revival to what the book is calling the Age of Progress. Another way to think about it would be from the age of the beginning, really, in the first couple hundred years after the Reformation, of the massive upsurge of human thought and development and advancement and achievement called the Enlightenment. That comes on the back end and overlaps with what's called the age of the Renaissance, or the Renaissance period, the rise of humanism, the scientific revolution. A number of things are happening all at once on the back end of really the collapse of the controlling authority of the Catholic Church in the European, primarily the European setting. And as a result of it, ironically, human beings are freed from the shackles of at least the Catholic definition of what it means to live a meaningful life. And they start asking lots and lots of questions about life itself, oftentimes including, but sometimes excluding, the notion of God and the hierarchy framework of belief that is the plausibility structure of a Christian worldview. So again, there's a lot of good and bad that occurs in terms of development and release of information, knowledge, sophistication, and so on in that long, drawn-out, several hundred-year period. But it's the beginning, really, of a whole new world, and the Reformation is a major central part of it. This particular section begins in chapter 32, which is part of the major division number 6. So I'm just going to read the Age of Reason and Revival segment. The Age of Reformation was marked by debate among Christians about the way of salvation. The Age of Reason was highlighted by the denial of any supernatural religion at all. Respect for science and human reason replaced the Christian faith as the cornerstone of Western culture, at least as it was emerging then. Many Protestants met this crisis of faith not by arguments, but by the experience of supernatural conversion. Faith was less dogma and more experience. This evangelical Christianity spread rapidly by the power of preaching alone, and many Christians came to see that state support was no longer essential for Christianity's survival. Modern Christians could accept religious freedom. So, chapter 13, aiming at the foundations, is the chapter that deals with this sort of age of reason that the subtitle of the chapter defines as the cult of reason. And you'll notice, if you haven't noticed already, that there's a little bit of back and forth on the timeline necessarily in these segments. It's one of the critiques of the book, is that as clear as the structure of the book is, it necessarily covers long and wide swaths of time and then backs up and starts again and then kind of overlaps in forward and reverse. And so it's a little confusing on the timeline side because of the way that the author has divvied up the thought forms of the ideas that flow in these times. And I'm mentioning that because it can give you sort of a false impression that if you rely strictly on the structure of the book, which is absolutely, helpful and practical in my estimation for clarifying the issues at hand, but if you rely strictly on the book's organization as if it were a chronological time frame formally, you're going to be a little confused as to the calendar, because again, we're moving ahead and then we're going back. We just talked about the Reformation of the early 1500s, and now we're all the way up into the middle 1600s, and it'll kind of ebb and flow on a chronology that way, because he's trying to encapsulate these thought forms or these paradigms of understanding that are simultaneously more or less rolling out, and some of them are overlapping, and some are sort of lining up more front to back. So hopefully that explanation is clear, and you'll take that into account as you're reading the book. Probably most of you have already figured that out, but just be aware of that. So the Cult of Reason really deals with the whole of the Age of Reason, which again can be defined with any number of date parameters, up to and including the post revolutionary period in the American colonies, with people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin being the leading sort of cultists in this period of human enlightenment and education and science and exploration and discovery. These Renaissance characters of the American colonial period become representative of the type of person that is at the forefront of this period of time, especially as the civilization advances towards the West and begins to take root in the Americas. The question for this chapter is, do our beliefs make us more tolerant, more respectful of those who differ with us, more responsive to the true spirit of Jesus, or not? And the challenge of the Cult of Reason period, or the spirit of the Age of Reason period, is that essentially human beings, not God, becomes the center of the universe. That is to say, the mitigator of reason. This is significant because this has a huge impact on the way we perceive of the Christian faith. You'll take note, for instance, that in our day and age, it's very popular and very common for people to focus on their own individualized experience, their Christian identity, which is not even a terminology that makes sense if you understand what identity is supposed to be defining. In fact, not to go off on a subject we don't have time to explore, but the whole idea of people pursuing their Christian identity is really missing the point of what it means to be a Christian. But all of these concepts, a lot of them psychological or humanistic, really come from a place of reorienting the universe, not unlike Copernicus did with his understanding, correctly as it turned out, that the universe finds its center in the sun for us on planet Earth, not on the Earth itself, or the planet that we live on itself. In the same way, a Copernican revolution happens in people's appreciation for who they are in the scheme that God has created, in creation and in the universe, and so there's this huge shift, and it's a majorly impactful shift on people's consciousness related to who they are and whether they or God are at the center of the universe in terms of making sense of life. And the shift really is decidedly towards human beings being at the center. The Renaissance really starts that, and these terminologies that I'm using are overlapping and interwoven. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, the rise of humanism, and so on. These are all movements in and of themselves that deal with certain aspects of human culture that are all happening sort of simultaneously and overlapping and intertwining one another. But the Renaissance is a period where tolerance and truth-seeking thankfully replace religious persecution as sort of the affirmative action that people take toward discovering and holding on to what is true in life. And that's a good thing. It again reflects a man-centered versus God-centered universe, but it is the beginnings of a time and place and period of human development where really our own significance as creatures, as human beings, as living organisms, as individual creations will take the forefront. The Wonder of the World machine That section of the chapter speaks of Isaac Newton's mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which dominate. Of course, that has a resonant impact on theology. The whole notion of a natural theology begins to take root. That's a theology that's rooted not in God's revelation necessarily, but in the natural world speaking to and of a greater creative force. One of several things wrong with natural theology is it depersonalizes the reality of God in the universe. But having said that, the point is that in this more naturalistic, scientific, human rooted experience of people, looking at life and trying to make sense of it, you have this major shift in perception about what truth is. And that impacts the church as much as the church attempts to impact the issues driven by that kind of massive collective paradigm alteration. The rise of the radicals is a section of the chapter that deals with the deists question of the foundation of faith. That is to say, people that believe in God but are not really terribly impressed with Jesus Christ as the Son of God or the Christian witness as it is classically presented. Thomas Jefferson would be a perfect example, and he's my ultimate example for what the Renaissance modern man looks like in the modern setting. He's filled with contradictions. So on the one hand, you've got Thomas Jefferson designing his own Bible by cutting out all the supernatural parts to it. You can see that in his home, Monticello in Virginia. If you visit there, they actually have that Bible on display because he didn't care for the supernatural part of it. He was a scientifically minded person, so rejected all of that. You have, the person that penned the Declaration of Independence, which is the inspiring document for all, democracies in world history from this point forward, and he's the owner of 200 slaves. I mean, on the one hand, speaking of human freedom and self-actualization and the pursuit of happiness. On the other, he doesn't even free the slaves that he's kept bound on his plantation for his whole life when he dies, including the woman that he's having an affair with and having kids with. So huge contradictions. He's the perfect example of a modern person, and he's a deist. That's the point. He's someone who believes in God but not in the witness of the Son of God coming and being involved with the human race in Jesus Christ. Christianity on Trial, then, that section deals with what I'm talking about, the truth that turns against the truth, the irony of the struggle itself for knowledge and truth, short of or separate from God's revelatory power in releasing truth to the human race, which is a classic Christian tenet. The futility of empty confidence, that last section of the book deals with the false optimism of deism and how deism itself undermines its own veracity by some of the contradictory aspects of believing in a God who is like a watchmaker just out there somewhere after he's created the universe and the human race and the earth and so on, and he's not really involved. He's just sort of watching, like that old Bette Midler song wants to try to convince us that from a distance God is watching us. The Age of Reason, then, in Reformation, the birth of the age of secularism, where faith is unhinged from the coercive power of the Catholic Church, and the Age of Reason changed the foundation of religious perception and persuasion toward conversion and faithful living. So, making a very short chapter, longer than I intended to make it, one of the helpful ironies about this focus on individuals is that it really creates the philosophical context and foundation for evangelical Christianity, which appeals to the individual person's conversion. And that's really important to get in early in this segment of the book, because church history is almost, completely radically redefined by just this philosophical shift in the culture, opening up a form of Christianity that's never quite been seen in exactly the way that it it is now, and even, and we'll talk about it before the end of this presentation, even has worked to transform evangelicalism in the hundreds of years period since, the Reformation, into something that even the evangelicals back in the heyday, which we'll talk about next, uh, probably don't recognize. Again, one of the neat things about this segment of the book is that it starts with this sort of dawning age of new potential in the human condition. Faith, Christian faith, is a central part of that. And it ends, as the book, divides it, with this next section called the Age of Ideologies, which in the information age, in the age of ideas that we now are fully gripped by, post-industrial historical context, right? The idea that that Christian faith could be reduced down to a set of ideological concepts, a matrix of idea, versus a transformational reality rooted in God's revelation through his son Jesus, is the big challenge of our time. So we'll revisit that, when we get towards the end of this segment. But keep in mind that with every good development, there's a corresponding undermining development. In this age of reason, with the focus on human beings as the center of the universe, there's the positive aspect of opening a kind of Christianity that's quite powerful and transformative in its evangelical appeal. At the same time, that same set of notions is undermining the reality of that form of faith lasting beyond the times in which we live right now, in the sense that it started. That is to say, as we'll talk about in chapter 41, evangelical Christianity has more and more become a set of ideas to sort of adopt into your life versus an invitation into a personal relationship with the transforming Son of God named Jesus Christ. And I know that for some of us, me saying that is offensive, possibly, but it's really where evangelicalism is going. And, you can see the hallmarks of it all over the place. So anyway, keep that in mind as we move into the next chapter. Chapter 33, The Heart and Its Reasons, deals with Blaise Pascal, the great mathematician, his conversion, and the Pietist movement. The key question of this chapter is, in the age of reason focused on intellect, how does mankind tend to the hungers of the soul? With a huge focus on the intellect and the human capacity for thought, the heart and the soul, which are classically seen as connected but separate from the mind, right, now become the set or the realm of concern for, rightly, the Christian faith. Because science begins to outstrip the faith in terms of answering the questions of existence. So faith has nothing really to say powerfully except to the human heart and soul. This is, again, one of those ironic developments where the shift in human philosophical foundation opens up the idea that there is now a separation between the head and the heart. And amongst other great writers that you should be accustomed and acquainted with, Gary Wills, who's a Catholic scholar, wrote a book called Head and Heart, American Christianities. And he is exploring, as a Catholic, this tension between faith that is primarily residing in the intellect and faith that primarily resides in the emotions or in the affections or in, the more nebulous parts of the human consciousness that is just as real as the intellect, but not as qualifiable and quantifiable. Herein, in this section in the history of the church, begins this open tension between head and heart, is my point. The key points in this chapter have to do with the appeals to cheap grace. The Jesuits hone the science of casuistry, thus promoting cheap grace. The idea there is that the Jesuits, always being fairly practical in their approach, begin to become more and more liberal out of their very conservative, devoted root, if you remember, under Ignatius Loyola, and they begin to want to propagate the faith in ways that, doctrinally speaking, become more and more compromised for the sake of seeing people, quote unquote, saved. And again, it's indicative of this shift from intellectual, apologetic appeal of the faith to a more emotionally rooted, primitive appeal set. Jansenism at Port Royal is really dealing with another aspect of that. Calvinism, as it sort of impacts the Catholic experience, and the Jesuits growing lax in their devotion to the rigorous framework of the truth. Certainty, Joy, and Peace is a segment that deals with Blaise Pascal as he attacks the Jesuit theological position as a new convert and one who's growing in his appreciation for the faith, but also has an intellect and a mind that can rival some of the greatest in this humanistic Enlightenment period. So he's wanting to bring a different kind of more intellectual understanding to the faith to try to right this tension and this balance. The Soul's Return to Life deals with the rise of pietism, which is another expression of this same set of tensions, where pietistic living, that is to say, a focus on the here and now and living a holy, devoted life to God with the idea that everything you do is worship and so on and so forth, none of which is a bad set of ideas, becomes kind of a counter response to this over-intellectualizing of life and this undervaluing of the intellectual veracity of the Christian faith. The Carpenter and the Count deals with Zinzendorf's part in carrying forward later expressions of pietism. Pietism becomes a huge component part of evangelicalism, the American colonial experience. So you begin to see sort of the major ingredients of the American Christian experience shaping up early in Europe and then being transported here. Things like pietism, things like the Anabaptist, Reform of the Reformers tradition, things like Puritanism, all of these elements begin to become intermingled in the American Christian experience. And although they hit the shores of the colonies in different ways at different intensity points, will pretty soon blend into an American evangelicalism that will both set the foundation for the Great Awakening and also flavor, regardless of the denominational persuasions and boundaries, a kind of human, man-oriented, personal, testimonial, personal conversion, come to Jesus kind of, faith that all of us have experienced, no matter what tradition we come from. Okay, View from the Rearview Mirror is the last segment in this chapter, and it deals with what I just said, pietism's impact around the world, but especially on the evangelical experience that will become the American Christian experience, that really focuses on the regeneration of the individual self and then the community versus the community and the conversion of people, within and to that community, as is sort of been classically true all the way through the Middle Ages and came from a more communal paradigm related to the experience of human life out of ancient times and out of even ancient Israel. So the answer to the key question in the Age of Reason, how does mankind tend to the hungers of the soul, is answered by practical living in ways like puritanical, pietistic, and other practices, where you have this idea that what's coming in the evangelical experience is now being foreshadowed by the emphasized role of the emotions and how that works out in your everyday life, and the affirming of the role of churches separate from the state-sponsored organizational or nationalistic church that is ultimately the Catholic Church. So in other words, two big things are happening: head and heart separation in the experience of human beings, and the separation of the church from the state, which is huge, because all the way through the Middle Ages, the church, remember, is the political system of the state, or states, or pre-states, pre-nation states, as you might more accurately describe it, during those, especially early, but all through the Middle Age period, the Middle Ages period. You have a conglomerate of territories, not nations. Ultimately, you'll have nation states, but somewhere along the line, with the loosening of the Catholic Church from the primary political dominant role it played, you also have first state-sponsored churches, and then fairly rapidly a separation of church and state that will last all the way through to our current day. So much so that the churches themselves, even as is being painfully experienced right now in this pandemic, right, are loath to find any help or support from the government. There is a separation in our understanding of our American political scene between church and state, and that's what we prefer to have happen. That hasn't been, the norm for most human beings over the course of church history. The church has been so closely aligned with the political powers that it's hard to tell the difference. And that, too, like we've explored, has been a big part of the Catholic Protestant tension set that led originally to the Reformation. Chapter 34, A Brand from the Burning, Wesleyan Methodism, speaks now of the beginnings of the evangelical movement as it will translate itself into the American scene. And John Wesley's part in that as a sort of preeminent evangelistic, revivalistic preacher who begins the denomination of Methodism, rooted in the idea that there's a method to seeing people come to Christ and grow and be discipled in their faith. Who are or were the evangelicals, and how do they gain major significance in Christian history is now introduced as a key question. And this chapter will answer that, but really begins a conversation about that that's going to continue through the rest of the book, because in the most universal sense, the idea or the terminology evangelical is anyone who is a Christian who believes in a personal conversion to God through Christ. That's a very broad definition of an evangelical, but essentially that's what it means. It means someone who believes in the good news or the evangel and how it changes a person's life. There are lots of expressions of that now, very diverse, but that's a massive shift in how the faith functions in the context of humanity, as I said, related to the philosophical shifts that happen in the foundation of human consciousness as a result of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, all of that. Okay. The evangelical awakening, Wesley really leads the way, leads the charge in pushing people toward a more personal, emotional, visceral response to the preaching of the gospel and the message of the good news of who Jesus Christ is. He's called the Little Giant. So that segment that comes next is about his primitive methodology, his focus on prayer, Bible reading, church service, and church engagement, his own personal conversion, not to Christ, but to a more vibrant form of Christianity that he'll become the chief spokesman of, is dealt with next. And this whole practice of going out, and doing revivalistic preaching in the open market, in the open field, in the open, literally in those days, the open farm field, like George Whitefield is picked up on. And then the appeal that Wesley brings to the common people and the greatest number of people is really the subject of that last couple of sections in the chapter. The Methodist structure of small groups and a disciplined life lived in a smaller context within the larger context of the church becomes, as you can easily recognize, pretty much the staple of how we do church today, right? I mean, up to recent days when we're all on video and digital delivery, the idea of going to church on a regular basis, praying, studying your Bible, and joining a small group is pretty much the method that is being promoted as being the key to conversion and growth. And it all came from originally John Wesley. Primarily, Wesley's Methodists, in answer to the question, and Whitfield's Calvinists started a movement of small groups focused on organized living according to prayer, preaching and evangelism, serving and attending church consistently, and set the tone for the 2 centuries to come. So where I want to leave that is, again, with this realization that the evangelical style of Christianity in the broadest sense is not the kind of faith that you would see active in the Middle Ages or prior. Although there's always been a personal dimension to it, it's never been as emphasized as it is in our time. And it comes from this period of post-reformational shift and change in Western Europe, and it's transplanted to the Americas through people like John Wesley and George Whitfield and others. The upcoming Great Awakening will be the first massive spread and introduction of this sort of personalized faith in the New World. And it is significant and highly imprinting, and it still remains with us today. Most people that consider themselves to be a real, true Christian are, in one sense or another, in the broadest possible definition, an evangelical, meaning they are personally connected to God through a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, usually gained by some sort of crisis moment where they became converted. If you recognize all of what I just said as your Christian experience, you're one of them, or we're one of us, okay? Chapter 35, A New Order of the Ages. Here comes the Great Awakening. So what was the Great Awakening? Why was it critical to the development of Christianity in America? Again, this chapter explores the whole idea that the church now is becoming more and more separate from the state. To make the church work, you're going to need active and engaged believers building, right, an organization, or voluntarism, which is another word for volunteerism, meaning people are just wanting to engage of their own initiative and accord. God's will in society presents the idea that there's tensions between the Puritan concept of government and conversion through evangelism that begins to grow more organically. Remember, the Puritans had a very clear, and you see it in the Massachusetts colony, very clear understanding that religion and faith should be connected to politics and civil life, unlike the American tradition that wants to separate those. And so in that colony and segment of the New World, you had a direct connect between the religious leadership and life itself on the street in America, unlike what you see across the country now. And so there's this tension that gets set up, but it is quickly resolved by the fact that the Great Awakening is a huge sweeping revival that affects every area and aspect of the country, and continues to as we move toward the Civil War period, with an interesting variation on the theme occurring up in New England, that segment on the New Lights, or the light inside movement, the transcendental expressions of the Christian faith that will become less than Christian. Ralph Waldo Emerson and other people will reflect that. You can read about in that segment. With that, alongside that, the advocates for religious freedom, the rise of the Baptists under Isaac Backus, the focus on personal conversion and holy living. Again, this separation between church and state becomes sort of the overriding norm. And the independent nature of these Protestants now being revived in the Great Awakening begins to flavor larger segments of the different kinds of denominational faith that are growing and developing in the country, as compared to the puritanical expression. The answer to the key question then is that the Great Awakening was the first of many rounds of revivals in America, shaping its citizens' core sensibility, a free, uncoerced, individualistic consent to partake in ecclesiastical, that's church, and civic programs set the stage for the spirit of the American Revolution. So you can't overstate the impact, really, in terms of the flow of American history from the early days of the colonies right on through, the Revolution and the formation of the states and all that comes next, the Great Awakening, and all of the impact that the revival and revivalistic focus of the Christian faith brings to the American experience is unprecedented, and it shapes everything. You could make argument that not everybody in the early settling of our country were Christian, and that would be an accurate argument. And a lot of people want to sell the idea that America is strictly a Christian nation, and of course it never has been, although it has been primarily a Christian nation. What you can argue, though, is the fact that the Christian experience has, more than any other experience, influenced the shape and the growth and the trajectory and the development of the America that we come to know today, because it has, and you can't get away from it. Anybody that tries to divorce American history from Christian influence, Christian thought, Christian foundational philosophy toward life just simply doesn't understand the connection between that and the American experience. Because everything about the American experience, all the major and minor events, are shaped by a Christian worldview. You tick off the list, the idea that slavery is wrong, manifest destiny, on and on and on, all the big sweeping things and all the stuff that's not so big, including the way we operate our government, and on and on it goes. It's all been penetrated by the Christian experience. So whether you believe or not we're an American, that America is a Christian nation from its origin, really makes no difference to the conversation that has to include that American formation, trajectory, growth, and development of the nation is a highly Christian influenced project. That America is a Christian nation in its net effect and development, more so than in its original conception. Although certainly the freedom to worship God in their own way and so on was a driving force for so many of the early colonial journeyers. The truth is that to make that the argument almost misses the point. The American experience is largely a Christian experience, whether you make exceptions or not to that. Oh, wow. Okay, I think I lost my... Sorry about that. I think I lost my slides. Okay, good. Go back. Here we go. All right. Push the wrong button in all my discussion here. Okay, we're back to the Great Awakening, chapter 35. All right, chapter 36 begins the next major division, which is division number 7, and that is the Age of Progress, which is a period of time from 1789 to 1914. And again, notice how the time frames kind of shift and flow back and forth, but he's trying to segment out certain idea sets for certain periods. In this period of time, American Christians saw new social unrest added to the intellectual challenges stemming from the rise of modern science. French Revolution, so this is the French Revolution and beyond period, unleashed new hopes and expectations for the common man. As did the American Revolution, power now seemed to be in reach of the masses and for the masses of people. How are Christians supposed to meet the needs of the urban masses who are now, both burdened with a more urban, industrialized work experience, and at the same time more freedom and power for their individual lives and life choice making. Christians were seriously divided over ways to face these problems without the traditional support of the state. Many Protestants turned to voluntary societies to minister to the poor and oppressed, as well as to carry the gospel to foreign lands. So we're backing up in time now a little bit to pick up what happens with the Catholic faith and how the Catholic faith looked upon all of these Enlightenment, Renaissance, humanistically driven changes in culture as the enemy, as fearful, as anti-systemic to their notion of what the church should be, and it is. And Catholicism, in a certain sense, locks up human consciousness in a certain way, while the rest of the world is carrying on forward into a more secularized age. Catholicism wants to lock people into a certain time frame and mindset that's more characteristic of the Middle Ages. It's one of the reasons why people will criticize Catholicism today, is that they feel it's just antiquated and archaic way of thinking about life in general, God in particular, encaptured as it is, concretized as it is in the system of this authoritarian church with a pope who is infallible. So the tensions surrounding how Catholics move forward in this tumultuous time of human change and realization and consciousness shift is the topic at hand in this chapter. The restoration of the fortresses, Catholicism in the Age of Progress, really just speaks to this notion that what Catholics do is set themselves up in this sort of fortress against change and against the revolutionary shifts in human consciousness. And the end result is less than what it should be and could be, given what I've already said about popular opinion about Catholic experience. We start with the French Revolution and how that is the old system being torn apart and rejected. That's on the tail of the American Revolution, remember? And how the Catholic Church sticks more with the older style of doing things. And that's a downside to the whole experience. Liberty, equality, and fraternity is the national motto of France now. It's the revolutionary motto that emerges in the French Revolution and becomes the defining experience of the French even up to this day. A French consciousness, like a European consciousness, that is ever increasingly secular versus faith-rooted. Part of that is driven by a rejection of the Catholic experience. Catholicism versus liberalism deals with how Catholics and their intellectual tradition, which is huge and significant and growing in this time, ironically, Catholics are known for having, a tremendous intellectual tradition. You look at many of the Catholic universities across the country, you see, Loyola Marymount and so on, other schools, Notre Dame, Catholics are not lacking in intellectual capacity by any stretch. What's happened is the Catholic Church has tried to retain its authoritarian power and thus held on to some of the older forms of thought, while ironically moving into the new world order in a major way, and it creates all kinds of tensions and points of battle and contention against the modern sensibilities, especially as it relates to modern conceptions about life, abortion, sexuality, the family, lots of different issues that we all recognize are Catholic hot buttons as well as Protestant concerns. In this time period, what you see is the shrinking of the authority of the Catholic Church down to the Vatican. That is to say, whereas prior to, ultimately, when the Catholic Church was in power across national and pre-national boundary lines in Europe and influenced the the royalty and the governmental systems of a lot of different regions, France, Spain, England, and so on. What happens ultimately is the Pope and his infallibility is successfully defended, meaning that he is, defended as God's representative who doesn't make mistakes. But at the same time, the power base shrinks to just the Vatican, which, if you're familiar at all with the Catholic experience, is like its own nation even today. The Vatican has territory, it has a government, it has an army, it has a capital in Italy called the Vatican. The Catholic structure shrinks in its political footprint, but it retains its position in human history in a significant way, regardless of the shifts around it. So, power is really the issue that Catholic leadership is dealing with, beginning at this period and moving forward. It's the issue they've always dealt with by definition, because the Catholic Church sees itself as the root of all Christian authority. You're going to have nothing but power plays and fights and struggles and so on. So nothing's, in some ways, nothing's changed, but power and its allure keep Catholicism captive in the old structure prior to and beyond revolution, isolating the Pope to the Vatican and relegating the Catholic faith to a strictly religious domain with cultural impacts versus a cultural political domain that controls everything. Chapter 37, A New Social Frontier, we begin to explore Christianity in the modern age. How do Christians view the world in the modern age is the question there. And we're now moving into, the 1800s in Victorian England, and how the rise of the evangelical movement gives birth to the Clapham sect and the Oxford movement, very different in their orientation, very different in their geographical location, but how Christians are becoming more and more engaged with cultural issues separate from the domineering political influence that the Catholic style of leadership provided, and instead become more politically rooted and grassroots oriented. The anti-slavery movement of William Wilberforce becomes one example amongst many. Prisons, poverty, missions, all these things become part of the menu of Christian concern. But from a decidedly politically oriented point of view, from the ground up versus from the authoritarian structure of the Catholic Church prior to, from the ceiling down, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So the hierarchy is completely shifted. The Reformation has shifted the grounds of all human interaction, relationship, community, and reality under it. And as a result, because we've rejected the Catholic hierarchy, there's a whole new way of functioning beginning to emerge amongst Christians on the street. The concept of being in the world but not of the world is the ongoing point of focus. How do we juggle, balance all these different domains of life, political, religious, communal, cultural? How do we integrate our faith through all of them and make a difference in the world? The evangelical answer to that is mission and worship. That is to say, going to church, nurturing, the communal and private experience of relationship with God through Christ, and then reaching out into the world to make a difference in the lives of other people, including spreading the gospel to other places in the world. Chapter 38, and we're almost done. To the earth's remotest places begins a focus on Protestant missions, which began in earnest in the 19th century under William Carey, the modern mission movement, the missions to Asia and Africa, the Baptist Missionary Society, the creation of the voluntary societies of the Christian denominations. All of this is explored here. The basic thrust of this is that people are becoming more and more oriented toward spreading the gospel and seeing the gospel impact the daily lives of people, and that's a good thing. But the Christian missionary movement in a global sense begins to really take root, and in fact in the 1900s and beyond, the spread of the gospel through the globe as a fulfillment of the Great Commission is experienced like in no other time in human history. So that's probably the most important thing to remember about this segment of church history, is that missions, in fulfillment of Matthew 28, now become bigger and better expressed all throughout the world than ever before. And that's a significant statement given what we've already explored with regard to Jesuits and the spread of the Catholic faith through the Spanish conquering and invasion of the Americas. You know, on and on you could go through a list of historical missions that we've already described, but nothing is as powerful and as widespread as the Protestant missions of the 1900s in the 1800s, beginning in the 1800s. And so that's what this section's about. Chapter 39, the destiny of a nation in Christian America, really begins to explore the colonies and how the American experience, again, is influenced by the originally UK or United Kingdom, Great Britain rooted evangelical movement, how that interpenetrates all of the denominational expressions and is propagated by the Great Awakening. And that first of several, there's a second Great Awakening and then several other waves of revival that sweep through the country. How all of those revivals influence and empower Christians to deal with the reality of the American experience, the rooting of Christianity and faith in Christ in the Black community as it is beginning to be expanded through slavery starts now. And then the interjection of the scientific humanistic elements of the Enlightenment begin to challenge classical theological positions held by Protestant Christians. And so you find this huge tension arising between secularized thought and religious thought. And down the middle of that is this whole question, going back again and picking up and carrying forward from where we were a couple chapters ago, of the urban experience, the rise of cities, the urbanization of America, the industrialization and the industrial complex, and how that influences and impacts American daily life, and how the Christian faith does and doesn't penetrate that experience of living, which is very different than the agricultural experience of the Civil War and pre-Civil War years. So America is changing, the industrial foundation, the commercial foundation of the country is changing, the culture is shifting and changing, and in all of this, the vision of a Christian America rises on the energy of people like Lyman Beecher and moves forward with missionary zeal through the expansion of the American West. I mentioned a minute ago the notion of manifest destiny. That's the idea that Easterners had when the West was still largely unsettled, that we had a divine commission as the American colonists, now becoming the American citizens of a new nation, to actually settle the whole country all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That notion wasn't just driven, that desire wasn't just driven by the commercial need, by the desire to see a new quality of life won for your family, by the desire to own land and a farm and and settlement and build towns and then ultimately cities. That was actually the conquering of the West, something that God was commissioning the American people to do, including, unfortunately, the decimation of the Indian tribes as a byproduct of that. All of that is a Christian-driven motivation. So the idea of a Christian America is very much active and vibrant in this period, and again, cannot be overstated as a major influencer of the whole of the entire multifaceted, complex American experience that is unfolding in post-Civil War period. Chapter 40 begins a kind of a new conversation about liberal Protestantism and how it, in response to the humanistic Enlightenment waves and influences of new human consciousness, begin to try to bring a Christian point of view to bear to a now newly human-focused, scientifically, technologically sophisticated age. And what a lot of people don't realize about Protestant liberalism in the history of the church is that it's really, a poorly motivated but legitimate response to the rising tensions that are found in trying to live the Christian life in light of classic supernatural doctrines in a time and place in human history where the supernatural is not largely and primarily thought of as relevant or real. So, how do Christians make faith relevant in the modern age of secular thought and philosophy becomes the question. The answer is that liberal forms of Christianity in America shake the foundations of the faith as deeply as the Reformation shook Catholicism, because so much of liberal Christianity does not involve classic, what we now call evangelical doctrine, or traditional, conservative Christian doctrines about the virgin birth and the miracle of the resurrection of Christ and so on and so forth. And so there's this exploration of how Protestant liberalism in the liberal denominations begins to take hold for a significant period of time before what's now a pretty precipitous decline in attendance and engagement, and how that influences the intellectual life of the American scene, and how evolution, Darwinism, biblical criticism of the higher and lower forms, all of those things that I teach on it in my Life of Jesus class. The search for the historical Jesus takes place. There's a whole lot of intellectualizing about faith that liberalism tries to deal with, and does so fairly unsuccessfully, to the point that we're now finding ourselves today again in this place of division between head and heart, and in an ever morphing and ever evolving evangelical experience. Chapter 41, end of this section. I mentioned it to begin with. I'm going to end here. Nothing to lose but chains. The social crisis is the focus of this chapter. It again sort of loops back into this idea of how does the Christian faith deal with the changed daily lives of human beings, citizens of these here United States, that are now living a very different life than their ancestors did, in a very different economy, in a very different urbanized setting, largely, but not totally, in a very different world, a very different universe than the early colonies, the post-revolutionary experience, or the Civil War experience reflected. The rise of the social gospel risks reducing the gospel itself to mere social activism or social justice theory enacted on the street for the benefit of the here and now experience of the suffering human race. But it reminds people, especially Christian leadership of all stripes, that there has to be constantly a balance crafted between the radical transformational revelation of what Christ has done in the heavenlies and in eternity, with the radical and challenging needs of the daily existence of human beings who live as average Joes and Josephines on the street. And none of that is a bad thing, but the social crisis of this increasingly industrial age really begins to push those points. I would argue, and this is in closing, that we now live in a very similar set of tensions driven by the information age, by the age of the internet, of the digitized experience, of the information overload that has come as a result of a whole new layer of human experience being added to the industrialized experience of previous days, and how faith is playing itself out there. And if you remember, we started this segment, this section, week 4, talking through the reality of where evangelical experience has been and is going, and the risk of our faith becoming nothing more than ideological in its impact. And I'll end with this, that one of the things that we've talked and touched on a little bit on Thursday nights, and I want to talk more about, is the reality that we live in a time when evangelicalism itself has become morphed, changed, in many ways misshapen, in lots of ways because of, and I'm not trying to be political here in terms of, signaling one set of loyalties or another, or trying to start a for or against Donald Trump, conversation. But the reality is, the way that he is leading the country right now, this crisis that we're currently in, which is revealing so much about both our strengths as a community and our weaknesses in our political system, and the identification that Trump makes with the evangelical community, which, started its political activism in a whole new way in the Reagan era, in the Bush era, and now, we see Paula White, of all people, this prophetess of the Pentecostal movement, is now the right-hand spiritual advisor of Donald Trump. Again, whatever you think of all of that, what you have to understand is that the risks that the evangelical American experience being reduced to an ideological experience with a political impact or focus versus classically what evangelical Christianity has always been seen as, which is a personal conversion, a revelational experience with God that leads to a changed life, is the real issue right now. And one of the ways it's manifesting, frankly, in a more generalized sense, is this idea that we now live in a time and a place in human history where there are tons of people who claim to believe in God through Jesus Christ. Very few of those people have the nerve to claim that they actually can live a life in these complicated times consistent with their belief. So the question is not whether you do or don't believe in Jesus. The question is, how do you live according to your belief in Jesus? And again, the political arm of the American evangelical experience right now, as it is moving more and more toward an ideological set of outworkings and applications, is an answer to that question, but I'm not sure the best answer to that question. How do we now live as believers? And so take that for what it's worth, but that's kind of like in chapter 41 where we leave this segment of church history, is with that set of tensions as to where evangelicalism is beginning to morph itself. And again, it's fascinating that the book itself picks up on this idea that the danger looming ahead is that Christian thought and life will be reduced to an ideology, which, if you're not familiar with that term, is concerning because, to use one example among several, the fundamentalist Islamic ideology that drove the terrorists to fly jet planes into the World Trade Center is one example amongst many of an ideology, whatever the content is religiously speaking, in this case Muslim, radical Islam. But the content really doesn't matter. It's the idea that an ideology, a system of thought, which Paul speaks against in the New Testament, right? The philosophies of men, those kinds of descriptors that Paul uses, is very much directed toward Greek ideology, philosophically speaking, of his context and time, not unlike the ideologies that rule and reign today in America and beyond. The danger of human ideology is really the issue here, not the content. So when I say that the danger of American evangelicalism becoming an operative ideology is a big deal, what I'm trying to say to you is simply that the reduction of a personalized faith to a thought system that drives behaviors that can sometimes be expressed in ways that are anti everything, anti-common sense, anti-scientific, anti-everything, is really, the set of concerns at the center of this conversation about the age of ideologies. there's a lot packed in that. If you're interested in talking more about that, send me some questions this week on the email, and we will talk about that. But that's kind of where we're headed in this next segment, and it is a set of very serious concerns for those of us who consider ourselves a part of the faith, especially the leadership part of the faith. Okay? All right, that's the end of this segment. We'll have one more of these in the 5th week, next week. But I hope you get a lot out of this, and I appreciate your time and energy spent.